It's great to see so many people here, especially on an event late in July. But I think, or hopefully, at the end of our event, everyone would have thought it was a worthwhile to come out in the heat for. And I want to introduce our guest who we have with us today, who's Jessica Montell. Jessica Montell is the director of B'Tselem. B'Tselem is the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. I'm not going to make any bones about it. I'm a big fan of Jessica and of B'Tselem's work. I think B'Tselem's work is absolutely essential to Israel, to Israel's democracy, to shining a light on things that perhaps people wouldn't want a light to be shone on. But one of the things that reminded me of why I'm so positively predisposed towards B'Tselem is just last year, Jessica, you had your 20th year anniversary. B'Tselem was established in 1989. And of course, in 2009, that was 20 years. And the adverts that B'Tselem chose to run in the Israeli press were, "It's with great sorrow that we announce the 20th year since the founding of B'Tselem. You're probably sick of us. To be honest, we're rather," this is free-flowing translation, to be honest, we're rather sick of doing this work ourselves, so let's all resolve to get this done and to end the violations of human rights in the occupied territories. Jessica comes from a background of being an international human rights lawyer. She actually hails from the West Coast, from San Francisco. She did her master's at Columbia. And how long is it that you've been executive director?
Since 2001.
So it's coming up on a decade that Jessica's been executive director of B'Tselem, having previously worked at Hamoked, which is another well-respected Israeli human rights NGO. I'm sure that when you got the invitation to this event, you didn't have to Google and look up what's this B'Tselem thing that Jessica Montell is the head of. B'Tselem has a well-earned international reputation for its work in documenting, in advocating with regard to what is going on in the occupied territories. It's been doing that, as I've said, for over 20 years. It has, and we'll talk about this, an interesting relationship with the Israeli authorities. They do see B'Tselem as a resource. They see B'Tselem as an organization that isn't always saying things they'd want it to say, but as an organization who they can't ignore and who they also work with. And, of course, the international community looks to B'Tselem, and that's one of the reasons that Jessica's here in Washington, where she's conducting a series of formal and informal meetings, and we're really pleased that you could spend some time with us. What Thanks. I thought we'd do, and let's do it against the backdrop of both reports out now. The two reports that have just been released by B'Tselem. One is the annual update on the human rights situation. The other is something you haven't done for several years, which is to take a deep look at the whole settlement situation, right, which is by hook or by crook. Your previous report was land grab, which I think was probably a more sexy name. But by hook or by crook is looking at the settlement situation in the territories. A very important thing for me to point out to the audience here is that for the last 2-3 years, B'Tselem has made the decision and implemented that decision to have an office here in the United States. It's not something B'Tselem did previously, but the newish, I can't call you totally new anymore, director of that US office of B'Tselem, who's a resource who's permanently here on the ground, is with us. And I'd just like to acknowledge Uri Zaki, and maybe if you stand up, Uri, so people can hassle you rather than Jessica in the future. And what I would like to do is have a conversation with Jessica, then we'll open it up for questions, rather than have Jessica do an all-encompassing presentation. And the first thing I really want to ask you about is set the stage for it, set the scene for us, which is kind of what this new report does. We talk about settlements, we talk about settlement expansions, settlement freezes. Walk us through what the West Bank looks like today in terms of, obviously much of this is about land, resources, access to those things. How do we end up in a situation where 60% of the West Bank is essentially out of bounds for Palestinians, where over 40% somehow is part of the jurisdictional area of settlements, even when the built-up area is so small. So perhaps to get us into this, give us that backdrop.
Sure. And thank you, first of all, for hosting, and it's very nice to be here. In terms of the physical built-up areas of the settlements, if you fly over the West Bank in an airplane, it's less than 1% of the West Bank is the built-up area of settlements. Now, the position of the settlements is quite significant. I mean, throughout the whole West Bank, controlling significant areas, but still 1% is quite a small area in terms of the actual built-up area of the settlements. But the municipal boundaries of the settlements are almost 10 times as large. So it's close to 10%, 9-point-something% of the West Bank are the municipal boundaries of the settlements. Those are closed military zones. It's a funny kind of a closed military zone. It doesn't apply to you or to me, who can go freely to those areas, but Palestinians require special permits to access the municipal boundaries of the settlement. So that's close to 10% of the West Bank. And then you have large tracts of land, basically all of the land reserves of the West Bank that have been declared state lands and been assigned to one of the regional councils of the settlements. And the report, By Hook and by Crook, which I'm a fan of that title, gives an indication of the way that the settlement enterprise, if there are legal means available, although of course we're talking about domestic law and not international law, which patently forbids settlements. But if under domestic Israeli law there's a way to legally take certain lands, they would take those lands. If Israeli law was somehow an obstacle, they would find some way to go around them. The land law in force in the West Bank is the Ottoman land law. And Israel claims to be applying faithfully the Ottoman land law, although in fact it's applied in an extremely manipulative manner about when land can be declared state lands, about how Palestinians were not given any meaningful opportunity to appeal the taking of those lands. Altogether, you're talking about 42% of the West Bank that has been assigned to the settlement regional councils or the municipal boundaries. And
so you have built-up area of settlements, municipal council, and then a much larger area that's defined as
regional councils.
Regional councils,
yeah.
Okay. Sorry, carry on.
And then it's easy to think, when you're talking about 42% of the West Bank, how that's going to affect Palestinian life in almost every way, shape, and form. We frequently talk about settlements as a political, diplomatic, international issue. For us, B'Tselem, as a human rights organization, we're looking at the way settlements are impacting daily life in the West Bank. And what you can see from the annual report, in some important ways, you've had improvements in human rights. The situation is not what it was 2003, 2004, with massive military operations in Palestinian cities, very high casualties. In that sense, there have been some improvements. When we look at what concerns us in the West Bank today, almost everything is in some way or another related to settlements. If you're talking about house demolitions of Palestinian homes, freedom of movement, the right to protection under the law, access to land, access to water, treatment of sewage, almost all of the human rights violations that we are concerned about today, in one way or another, can be linked back to the settlements.
Now, you touched on something in passing, which is this gulf between international law, certainly as you see it, and how the Israeli court system and Israeli domestic law. Now, obviously, what B'Tselem's work in terms of documenting human rights violations is predicated on international law and how that should be applied, as you see it to the occupied territories. Could you walk us through that? Where do you derive that interpretation from? Where do you differ from the Israeli official interpretation? And I guess perhaps most important for the purposes of this conversation, does it matter whether America is defining settlements as illegal, for instance, whether it's an international law-based approach to what goes on in the territories? Where does this administration stand, and previous administrations?
So I start with the first. The laws governing occupation are international humanitarian law. You have two treaties that are applying, and Israel recognizes the application. Today you don't have You used to have some legal gymnastics of Israel to claim that the Fourth Geneva Convention doesn't apply. You don't have that anymore. So you have the Hague Regulations of 1907, which says that when an occupying power takes territory, the military steps in to the place of the sovereign, in this case, taking the place of Jordan. And then there are only two means or two guidelines for how the military can operate. Everything that is legitimate that the military can do in the occupied territories has to be one of two justifications. One is military necessity. Of course, a military has the right to defend itself, to do what is necessary for its own military needs. And the second is the welfare of the local population. So everything taking place in the occupied territories should be justified on one of those two bases. Any change of the pre-existing legal status, any construction, any changes. The other principle is that occupation is supposed to be temporary. So all permanent changes are prohibited, in fact, unless they are for the welfare of the local population. Now, there's no way you could argue that the settlements Israel initially argued that they were for military necessity. In 1979, you had an important high court ruling that said settlements are not military needs, are not advancing military needs. Clearly, they're not advancing the welfare of the Palestinian population. So on the basis of the Hague Regulations, which Israel recognizes as binding, settlements are illegal. And then you have the Fourth Geneva Convention, the explicit prohibition in Article 49 of transferring your population from the occupier into the occupied territory. So to my mind, it's quite a clear-cut case that settlements are illegal. In terms of the U.S. administration, I think it is important that it not just be a question of settlements being an obstacle to peace, that it's not only one of the bargaining chips in these negotiations. Law has meaning because we recognize the power of the law. And it shouldn't be the case that when it's convenient, we buy into legal prohibitions, and when it's an obstacle, we don't. I mean, I think there would be not only a practical but also a value to the U.S. administration also asserting relevance of international law.
Now, in that respect, is the U.S. an outlier? Are other international actors, do the quartet partners use the terminology of illegality?
Yes. For the European Union, the international law is quite present in terms of their articulation of the problematics of settlements.
So the approach that this administration has chosen to take, like many administrations that preceded it, not talking in the rubric of international legality, but how this impacts the peace process, for instance. So we're obviously 8 months into a 10-month set of understandings regarding what should and should not be happening in terms of settlement expansion. Right. Where are we? What are you documenting in terms of what has gone on during this 8-month period? But put it in the context of again, the bigger picture of, my understanding is that there's a set of incentives that are still being applied.
Right.
That Israel committed not to apply, and those are still being applied. So has there been too narrow a focus just on kind of bricks and mortar of one house? How do you look at this period?
So the settlement freeze, which is quite short term, and then when you look at the lengthy planning process in terms of expanding settlements, it is a little bit too short framework in order to see whether there is any significance in terms of this 10-month freeze. You have seen some slowing down, if you like, of the settlement construction process. I mean, houses that had already begun construction were allowed to continue. Here and there, the Minister of Defense approved new construction. East Jerusalem was initially not included, and now maybe has a de facto been also included into the freeze. But of course, all of the planning processes are continuing, and all of the benefits, it still is the case. Settlements are just defined as national priority areas. like other regions of Israel, I mean, Israel would like to encourage people to move to the south, to the Negev desert, so you get certain financial incentives to do that. And likewise with the occupied territories, with the West Bank, which is quite counterintuitive. On the one hand, freezing settlements. On the other hand, investing money to encourage people to move into the settlements. So you have cheaper land. If you want to buy land, you have better...
This is state land that would be made available. How
yes,
does that work?
Under subsidized terms, you would be able to obtain state land to construct settlements. You would be able to, for your own house, get better mortgage terms in a settlement than, say, I could get in my neighborhood. You have a lot of...
You don't live in a settlement?
No,
okay.
West Jerusalem. You would have a lot of investment from the ministry, almost all of the government ministries, but say the Ministry of Education, that in settlements you have a long school day, in settlements you have free nursery schools, whereas in most areas inside Israel you have to pay for that. Investment in industry and industrial zones. I mean, a long list of financial benefits that are still pouring into the settlements. And then, of course, that creates a migration of Israelis from Israel into the settlements. In fact, the settlements are growing at a much faster rate than Israel. It's something like 6%. Settlement growth rate inside Israel, 1.8%. So it's almost over three times. And 20% of that is people moving. It's not only that they have higher birth rates in the settlements. Some communities, you're talking about ultra-Orthodox settlements with very high birth rates, but 20% of that is people moving from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa to the settlements. So that, I mean, again, you have a schizophrenia of government policy that certainly should be sorted out.
And that's a process that's taking place, from what you're saying and from what I know as well, across the whole gamut, essentially, whether it's the infrastructure ministry or the housing ministry or the agriculture ministry or trade and industry. All of these would have their units that are easing this whole process.
Right.
And then in addition, which you touched on, which I'd like you to unpack more, because someone who you know very well and who I think represents B'Tselem in some of its legal cases, Michael Sfard, we hosted here, I think just after this arrangement on settlement slowdown was announced. And his message to an audience here at New America was, look at the planning process, because until they freeze the planning process, we're not in a new meaningful space. Is that something you'd accord with? And
yes,
maybe
absolutely.
Tell the story of what's happened in that planning process since Michael was here.
So I would start even with this land control, with this 42%, that again, 32% of the West Bank, which is outside of the municipal boundaries, these empty lands that should be land reserves for the Palestinians. I mean, if you're talking about a Palestinian population that needs to develop an economy, develop new agriculture or industry or tourism, they don't have access to that land. I mean, one of the most striking examples, the Dead Sea, which is a unique natural resource, half of which is adjacent to the West Bank, half adjacent to Israel. And Israel exploits the Dead Sea quite well, both for minerals that are harvested from the Dead Sea and for tourism. And theoretically, the Palestinians could do the same, except that all of the Dead Sea, the areas around it, are part of these regional councils of settlements. Even Palestinians would not be able to come to the beach at the Dead Sea, much less develop tourism or other projects. So even before you get to the planning processes, the idea of land control is crucial and should be part of the demands that not only freezing settlements, but also things like unused land could be returned to Palestinian control so that they could benefit from it. But in terms of the planning process, this is one of the few areas that is still under the control of the Ministry of Defense. Almost everything else is civilian inside the settlements. I mean, although settlements are in occupied territory, theoretically governed by military law, in fact, in a piecemeal fashion, everything has been transferred or annexed in a de facto way. So almost all Israeli laws are applying in settlements. In terms of planning, it still is within the Ministry of Defense. Theoretically, the Minister of Defense could be much more involved if he wanted to in terms of freezing the planning process. And yet this process is continuing, again, on two parallel tracks. I mean, you have a very theoretical planning track for Palestinians with no construction approved, demolition of houses that are built illegally, and at the same time, a very generous planning process for Palestinians. And you still have...
for Israelis.
For Israelis. And at the same time, you still have all of this illegal construction that is taking place, the so-called outposts, where even when the Ministry of Defense has identified illegal construction, there's no enforcement. Again, in stark contrast to enforcement of building violations identified for Palestinians.
Now, again, to put this into context, there is 7-year at least commitment on the part of Israel.
Right, since the roadmap.
Since the roadmap.
Yeah.
It's, of course, mentioned in the Mitchell report, but formalized in the roadmap to dismantle all these outposts.
Right, and to freeze construction and not to allow settlement construction. That's since the roadmap.
Not going so well?
Settlement construction, you should not have had new settlements created, and you've had at least three new settlements, and you shouldn't have had construction beyond natural growth.
And the outposts are all still
right.
there, essentially. We might come back to these issues, and certainly people here might want to raise some of these issues, but of course the reality today is that in the 20-odd minutes we've been talking, we haven't mentioned Gaza, and were we to mention Gaza, which we're going to now, we'd be talking about a very different reality.
Yes.
Because not only are there two Palestinian regimes in Gaza, but essentially Israel and, let's be honest, America and the international community apply two different
right.
Approaches. And, of course, Gaza is while I think the preponderance of international legal opinion is that Gaza is still under occupation.
No, I would say it's quite a gray area from an international legal perspective.
Now, obviously much of your updated report covers post-Kar-Sled and Kar-Sled itself. Israel's operation just over a year ago in Gaza. B'Tselem, got to doing its thing very quickly, investigating what had gone on, trying to uncover things that weren't necessarily being uncovered in the mainstream media or by Israel's internal investigations. You called very early for there to be an independent investigation.
Right.
And while not embracing chapter and verse of the Goldstone report, you did encourage its main finding, or its main ask, which was for there to be an independent, credible investigation to be undertaken. There's been a whole series of news reports coming out in the last few weeks and months in Israel, which it's almost, as you say, there's something of a schizophrenia going on here, where while the official Israeli governmental position is vilification of Goldstone, the report, the individual, what's actually been going on inside the system is several of the things pointed out in the Goldstone report do seem now to have in some ways been investigated. There are cases being opened against certain people. Many of the things that B'Tselem brought to light. Where are we today? Does everyone owe Goldstone a big apology? Are you now? Do you feel that the investigations are in a place they should be in? How does it look to you?
You have something like 50 criminal investigations opened by the JAG's office, the Judge Advocate General of the military. We sent about 20 cases to the JAG's office. Maybe half of those there were criminal investigations, and we worked quite closely, facilitating witnesses, providing other information. I mean, those individual cases, I would say, have been investigated fairly professionally and seriously. And you had your first major indictment filed about 2 weeks ago of a soldier accused of manslaughter for killing 2 women, a case that B'Tselem sent to the JAG and worked very closely with the JAG to bring about the indictment. At the same time, there is a feeling of unease that this is the track that the investigations have taken. In that, when you're talking about criminal investigations into individual incidents, almost invariably it's the low-level soldiers that are going to be held accountable. I mean, in this case, that is the case. You're talking about a soldier who, if in fact he's guilty of what he's accused of, then he certainly should be punished. But he can't be the only one. I mean, the allegations raised by B'Tselem and by others are primarily on the level of policy, of military policy and government policy. And this is not something that military police investigations can address. I mean, what were legitimate targets during Cast-Led, which in some cases were targets that we define as civilian targets? Who decided that those are legitimate targets? It's certainly high-ranking officers of the military. It's probably the JAG himself. So it's not feasible to think that the military police would be looking into those sorts of questions. And then the civilian leadership as well, that certainly played a role in deciding the levels of force involved, the overall policy. There are, I think, more questions remain open than have been answered still a year and a half after Operation Cast-Led. So for that reason, we can't be satisfied with military police investigations. There needs to be some sort of comprehensive look at the overall policies regarding Cast-Led.
And at the risk of getting too far into the weeds, which I just want to do briefly, it would not have been precedent-setting for Israel to establish the kind of investigative committee that you called for. I mean, there exists provisions in Israel. There exist precedents. What was it that you called for, and why don't you think it was set up?
So Israel has a very long history of commissions of inquiry into, any sorts. I mean, certainly the Lebanon War, other sorts of major events, and even, in some cases, what would seem to be minor events. I mean, it's quite common to have different sorts of commissions of inquiry set up. But you would need to have a public outcry. I mean, almost invariably, it's a response of a public outrage, public outcry that would lead to those sorts of investigations. In the case of Cast-Led, of course, you didn't have that. You had overwhelming support on the part of the Israeli public. And for that reason, I mean, what we are calling for is an independent investigation, say, under the Attorney General, an investigation that would be independent of the military, that would be impartial, that would have the tools in order to look both at these broad questions as well as at the individual cases that come up.
Now, this issue is still alive, right? Because the UN is supposed to, the SG, I believe, is supposed to report back on what kind of an investigation Israel has or hasn't carried out. Where are we in that?
So I think it's this week that the Secretary General should have submitted a report, both on Hamas, the requirement that Hamas conduct investigations, and we know that Hamas has done nothing to fulfill that obligation, and also on Israel's measures. And you had a big report that the Israeli Foreign Ministry put out last week to show just how far they've gone. And in some cases they have made, I mean, as you say, things that if they had done them a year ago, probably we wouldn't have a Goldstone report. But still, to my mind, it's not far enough, and I would expect that the United Nations would also continue to push Israel for a more comprehensive investigation.
Let me flip that and take you out of your comfort zone of law and ask you for a value judgment. Had we not have had Goldstone, to the extent to which there have been cases opened, there have been inquiries, are there things that Israel has done that you think have been a consequence of Goldstone?
To my mind, there's no doubt that Israel would not have undertaken the measures that it has in terms of accountability in Cast-Led were it not for, the Goldstone process. Goldstone now is a code for a whole process that was set in motion. Without doubt, that is what galvanized Israel to investigate many of the cases it has investigated.
And just sticking with Gaza for a minute and beginning to draw our closed part of this conversation to a close. We had the flotilla incident. There's been a change, a declared change, and I understand a change on the ground in the policy vis-a-vis the closure on Gaza. Where does that stand? It's obviously new, right, but to the extent to which the B'Tselem folks are wrapping their heads around that, what are you saying at the moment about access, being able to get things out as well, the closure system in Gaza?
Right. So the closure is a two-way street, obviously. Nothing getting in, or very little getting in, and nothing getting out. And our demand, in order for daily life to get back to something looking like normal in Gaza, you would need to have imports and exports and people being able to move in and out of Gaza for all sorts of reasons. Since the flotilla disaster, Israel has committed to opening up imports into Gaza, and you have had a real reduction of the restrictions in terms of commercial goods getting in, humanitarian goods, in some cases also construction material. And a year and a half later, since Operation Cast Lead, with all of the devastation in Gaza, you still see that very visibly in Gaza because people haven't been able to rebuild all that was destroyed. So over the past few weeks, you have had much more getting into Gaza than before. There's no change in terms of exports at all, and there's no change in terms of people being able to move in and out. So still, it's a very limited, it's a welcome first step, but still very limited. I would not want this to be the end of the conversation about the Gaza siege.
But even if everything that the Israeli government committed to post-flotilla were fulfilled, chapter and verse, that's still where we'd be, right? There's no commitment there to an economy where things can go out.
No, Israel has not made any changes in its declarations regarding exports or people moving in and out. But, it's quite ironic to me that it was this flotilla that, Israel's worst nightmare, that then forced it to reevaluate a policy which now everyone agrees was not at all serving Israel's interests, not its security interest, not any other interests. I would say the same about the policy as a whole. It is not in Israel's interest to keep Gaza poor and desperate, to keep the middle class without any ability to be productive and self-sufficient, to keep people from studying medicine and human rights and other things outside of the Gaza Strip. To my mind, it's in Israel's best interest, and certainly in Gazans' best interest, that the whole policy be re-examined.
Right. It's not something I think we'd agree on, that both of us have been saying for a long time. And, for me, part of the story of the flotilla is where you don't have a credible international policy, something else is going to fill that vacuum.
Right.
So it was activists on the Mavi Marmara and other ships that led to a change in the reality. But I unfortunately think that the administration here, and not them alone, Europeans and others were really absent on that whole issue. I want to ask you this, which is a slightly different angle. What's it like to be Jessica Montell in Israel in 2010? In the following sense, this is just all kinds of things to do with your kids that would be delightful to hear about, but isn't exactly what I intended by the question. You, I think only in the last fortnight, for instance, had been calling for an investigation into a case a year and a half ago of a Palestinian, Ashraf Abu Ahmed, who in a demonstration in Nahlin, which is one of the areas in the West Bank where there are ongoing demonstrations against the confiscation of lands, the roots of the separation barrier, he gets killed in an incident with involving a gas canister, I believe.
Yeah, Bassem Abu Rahmi.
Bassem Abu Rahmi. You'd been calling on the Israelis to act on the information that was available, and they did. And I don't know what percentage of work it is, but clearly a chunk of B'Tselem's work is talking to the IDF, talking to the government, talking to the JAG, sharing your information, and there are occasions where there is a responsiveness. At the same time, and you referred to it earlier in terms of the public mood, where you're traitors, for want of a better word, in many people's eyes. There's a delegitimization of your work. And there's some evidence that the government is hand in glove with some of that delegitimization campaign and things that have gone on in the last year. In that sense, what's it like to be Jessica Montell in Israel in 2010?
So it is interesting that I think the public climate in Israel in some ways is more hostile to the human rights message. You certainly have a more right-wing government than we've ever had, which is also quite hostile to human rights organizations and to initiatives from the international community regarding human rights for Palestinians. And at the same time, our relationship with the military has continued or even improved over the past year. I mean, this same period, I think it's quite interesting to see, well, the professional bodies that we are working with that recognize the value of B'Tselem's information, the role that B'Tselem plays. It's about 30% of our work that is pursuing accountability on these individual cases. So it's daily contact with the JAG's office, with the military police, with the Justice Ministry, on the individual cases, asking for investigations, providing information, arguing with them when they say we don't have enough evidence to bring a charge on this or that, and then we try and see if we can push them or get new evidence. I mean, it's quite an intense relationship, and one, I think that there's a lot of respect on the part of the military, and you've seen this both in the criminal investigation filed for Cass Led on manslaughter, where the JAG went out of his way to say that they couldn't have done it without B'Tselem. That sort of rhetoric is quite different than what you hear coming out of the Knesset on human rights organizations in general. So,
the thing that springs to my mind when you're saying that is, this public atmosphere. How far can that be stretched when elements of the legal establishment and the security establishment understand that this is disastrous for Israel? If there's no internal accountability, if there's no international credibility, if an organization like B'Tselem can't come to Washington or comes to Washington and says, we've tried everything. For the first 21 years of our existence, there was some capacity to have this conversation. It doesn't exist anymore. They know that they need to keep those channels open, and yet they're operating in a public environment which is ever less conducive to them doing that. I mean, for many, many years, in many of these issues, we saw the court system, the Supreme Court certainly, as the ultimate bulwark against the implosion of even more of Israeli democracy. Right. But the judges don't live on independent islands. The judges live in Israel. How concerned are you that element of the narrative in which Israelis live, the narrative coming out of the Knesset, is spinning out of control? Or are there enough, and it's probably somewhere in between, but I'm interested in your take on this, or are there enough kind of cool, wise heads in senior enough positions, like a Dan Meridor, who I think consistently tries to adhere to these lines, that we're not there yet. Don't overdo the panic.
You have a lot of populism in the Knesset. I mean, certainly people that are playing to the lowest common denominator. I mean, maybe the Kadima party is the best example of. We have now 3 bills proposed in the Knesset. I mean, each sort of more crazy, if you like, or populist than the next regarding the activity of human rights organizations. One of them says any organization that distributes information abroad about war crimes committed by Israeli forces will be made illegal. I mean, it's even a nonsensical, it doesn't say misrepresenting the brave actions of our troops as war criminals, right? If there actually were war crimes committed, it's saying if you publicize that abroad, you'll be outlawed as an organization. I mean, these are sorts of legislation that I would expect the Knesset, at the end of the day, to be responsible enough not to pass. But the fact that you have the legislation being proposed, again, by what should be mainstream politicians is quite worrisome. But at the same time, you have...
So are you saying that there are Kadima members of Knesset, Kadima being the oppositional centrist party of Lebanon, on board in signatories to or proposers of?
Yeah, the war crimes proposal is initiated from Kadima. I think it's Ronit Tirosh, who was the former director of the Education Ministry. So it's, quite worrisome as a trend. But when you look, what is interesting, you take a body like the Foreign Ministry, right? On the one hand, the rhetoric coming out of the foreign minister himself, who is very hostile, and on the other hand, the civil servants, high-ranking civil servants who understand the value of B'Tselem. I think both for Israeli society, but certainly for their work explaining Israel to the rest of the world. I mean, when you go to the Human Rights Committee and talk about Israeli democracy, they know to say, look, we have B'Tselem. right? That's the best evidence there is to the vibrancy of Israeli democracy. So, I think you can't embrace B'Tselem and expect us to be quiet and not cause too much trouble at the same time.
Although some people think it would be nice. Last question.
Yes.
Given what's driving the news here today, the WikiLeaks and the Afghanistan documentation, how's the Israeli whistleblower community going?
Well, it's a continuation of the previous question. I think, again, Israel would like to shoot the messenger rather than respond to the message. That, I think, is the lesson that we saw very clearly from the Goldstone report, that if we just bury our head in the sand, we don't have to engage with the message. If we throw enough mud at the messenger, maybe it will go away. We've seen that that's not the case, that in fact there's no alternative rather than to actually engage with the message itself.
And without exposing anyone or anything, if possible, material that comes your way, has there been a noticeable change in one direction or the other? Or much of it is anyway relying on Palestinian sources rather than internal Israeli sources?
We're mostly relying on public sources and Palestinian sources and freedom of information.
Right.
Petitions here and there. We have some leaks in the military that come our way. Individual soldiers, that has remained constant, I think.
Okay. I want to open it up to a broader conversation, but I appreciate you engaging with me over the last period, and we'll start. Yeah. And if people can introduce themselves as...
Thank you. I'm Tom Getman, an NGO executive. Jessica, breathtaking.
Yes.
Thank you. Come often. Implications of Ehud Barak's visit vis-a-vis fanning the flames of military attack on Iran?
Oh, it's way out of my area of expertise.
But in terms of how visits by government officials here affect your work on the ground, is there any implication at all? Do you get feedback from your own people in regard to, or your sources, per the last question? Is there an increase when there's an uptick here of things that might affect the body politic
Well, of course it's related. We have an office, B'Tselem has an office in Washington because much of Israel's politics are played out in Washington. So, everything then echoes back to Israeli society and Israeli politics.
We'll stay in the front, but also it's at the best of times it's very difficult to see people at the back with the lighting here, but when I'm low on this chair it's even more difficult. So if you're not in the front sections and you do want to be seen, make the effort to be seen. Thanks.
My name is Ira Weiss. I'm representing only myself. I have a kind of a historical political question more than a human rights one. I can remember back in '73 when Gush Emunim began the settlements. And at the time, I was under the distinct impression that the Labor Party was quite uniformly and strongly against this very beginning of the settlements. And yet, from '73 till today, if you look at a chart, a graph, it looks like the settlement increases have been just about the same under Likud and under Labor governments. How did that happen?
Well, it is the case. You have investment in different areas. Some areas that were seen as consensus by the Labor Party that they were investing in all along. So you're right that regardless of which government was in power, things like national priority areas like Gush Etzion, Ma'ale Adumim, East Jerusalem, that were seen as consensus areas for the Labor Party as well, and investment continued.
We'll stay. If you want chapter and verse on this, then Akiva Eldar and Edith Ziltal's Lords of the Land book is a phenomenal resource, as is Gershon Gorenberg's The Accidental Empire. Not least for the light it shines on the surprising role as the father of settlements that Shimon Peres played, and not an insignificant figure in the Labour Party for many, many years. We'll stay down at the front, and then I'll come to the back.
My name is Warren Manison, representing myself. Thank you very much for this presentation. The thoughts that went through my mind, and I'd like to have you respond to it, though, maybe the association here, the foundation has to. on something as huge as all of the issues that we have facing us here. It seems to me that it would benefit all of us to hear both sides of the particular issues that Jessica brought up. I mean, we talk about human rights and so forth in the territories. It's, you know, Israel has not been right in everything, neither has it been wrong in everything, but why aren't you addressing the human rights by Palestinians against Palestinians? Why aren't you addressing, for example, the use of human shields, which was really the basis of a lot of the problems that existed in Gaza, or the history itself of the relentless attacks on Israel, which has resulted in the kind of things that you're talking about. So there are two sides of every single issue. And I just sort of wish that we could hear both sides and responses to what you're saying. You know, like you mentioned in Gaza, Israel has been shipping in about 800,000 tons of supplies yearly before the flotilla incident. And the week after, 500 Gazans went into Israel, as they've done throughout the years, for medical attention. So there are two sides of every issue. And I feel sad that I'm not really hearing that other side. But mostly I'd like to hear your response on, you mentioned the roadmap as one example where Israel did not fulfill certain obligations. Well, that's been the history from day one, Oslo in particular, and the roadmap in itself. I can't remember all the details, but it seems to me they're called upon Palestinians to fulfill some of its objectives, which it never did. Yet you did not mention any of that. So how do you address the balance, the equality, so that in order to resolve the issue, you've got to understand both sides of it, not just one?
So I think your question...
I'll just say one thing as the New America Foundation, which is, you know, we've certainly had speakers here who are highly critical of the Palestinian Authority and of the way the Palestinian Authority is conducting itself. And I'll let Jessie
Yes,
address
I mean, of course, it's important that a forum like this address also Palestinian... Excuse me?
Well,
I'm an Israeli organization, so my job is to make Israel respect the law and be, live up to the highest ethical standards. Here and there, we're also speaking out where I think we have a role to play in criticizing human rights violations by the Palestinian Authority or by the Hamas government in Gaza. But, you know, my mandate is, as an Israeli organization, working where I can be most effective to make my government respect the law. That's what I'm an expert on. That's what I was invited to speak on. Of course, it's worthwhile, crucial, to have speakers come talking about PA and Hamas, respect for human rights, and other issues as well.
We're going to go to the back of the room, to the lady in the corner here, furthest away from you, Jonathan.
Thank you. My name is Carolyn Poplin. I'm an attorney. I was struck by something you said about Gaza, that Israelis... the flotilla has been an opportunity for them to reassess the Gaza, the Gaza strategy and maybe choose a more productive one. Is that the large majority of Israelis, or is that just a few on the left?
Well, it's not a few on the left. It's quite striking. Before the flotilla, you could not get any major commentators, public figures, politicians to reopen this conversation about what is the objective of the siege on Gaza, how are Israeli interests being served, not to mention, is it legal, is it moral, right? I mean, for B'Tselem, the last two are the crucial questions, but even the first two, you couldn't get Israelis to engage with those questions, although to my mind, it seems very clear that the Gaza siege is counter to Israeli security interests as well, when instead of having a controlled import and export via Israel, which is what you had 5 years ago, you have a free flow of weapons and everything else coming through the tunnels from Gaza. But you couldn't have that conversation in Israel until the flotilla disaster. And then after the flotilla, all of a sudden every commentator and many members of Knesset and public figures and columnists and everybody else was saying, well, of course, this doesn't serve our interests. There's no security logic to this. It's clear it's untenable and has to be reevaluated. So, I mean, it's a welcome change. It's very sad that it had to come about under these circumstances.
Mr. Consensus, Yair Lapid.
Yeah.
We'll stick right where you are, Jonathan, just next to you. probably ask people to stand as well.
Oh,
That's
yes,
okay.
I'm Ron Stoltz. I'm a friend of the New America Foundation, and I'm from San Francisco also. This may be a little far afield, but we begin in the U.S. press to see incremental changes, potentially in Egypt, potentially in Syria. Not really dramatic ones, but small ones. And I wondered, not an international politics question, but do you have human rights organizations in other countries in the region that you speak to or coordinate with or form a consensus?
Well, we are working most closely with Palestinian human rights organizations addressing human rights in the same geographic area. We meet as colleagues with human rights organizations in Egypt and Jordan in the Maghreb region. Of course, Syria is much more restricted. I haven't met a Syrian human rights activist actually living in Syria. So, I think obviously some countries are much more open and others less so, but certainly in most of the countries of the region, you have human rights organizations in one way or another.
And the chat. Yep. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Annabelle Fisher. I live here. I'm an American. I'm Jewish. I appreciate this gentleman's comment about hearing both sides of the story. My mother used to say there are three sides, his, hers, and the right one. My question has to do with the current, not only human rights, but political atmosphere now. There's a lot of discussion about solving the problems in the Middle East with the Palestinians. I hope to get to Israel before I die, but I may not. What are the sentiments and feelings with the Israelis and the Palestinians, especially the younger generation, I don't know about the older ones, to make some peace, to live with the settlements in their land and the Israeli lands, the effect of oil and water and land? And is there a movement, because I get the feeling that our current administration and the current administration in Israel with Netanyahu, they're not getting along too well. How is this going to affect, if ever, there will be a peace process in the Middle East? I've always said that, you'll never have one because you won't find two Jews who will agree on anything. Also, the lack of trust. So I think with the Palestinians, the Muslims, my neighbors are Muslims in my apartment building. They're wonderful people. Where do you see it? Human rights is fine, but there's some blame to go around on both sides or all sides. And where are we going now with the peace process, not only in the Middle East, but with the other countries, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Gaza? What's happening? What's going on? That's a big question. But,
yes.
But, when you talk about human rights and you talk about just Israel and you talk about...
Well, I'm going to ask you to... we have invited the executive director of a kind of very renowned and respected Israeli human rights NGO, so...
Yes, I should say we have a very limited mandate, so I can speak only to human rights issues in the occupied territories. It's a big topic, but certainly much more limited than the broader questions of all of the problems of the Middle East. In terms of the Israeli public climate, and you asked about young people, it's quite striking that although, to my mind, it's urgent to resolve these problems, and I hear you saying that as well, on the part of most Israelis, you don't sense any urgency. The situation for Israelis is quite quiet now. The security situation, Israelis don't feel this general sense of insecurity like we had, say, 2002, 2003, 2004 with bus bombings and other attacks, even Qassam rockets from last year and the year before. We don't have, I should knock on wood. So the upside of that is that you don't have a sense among Israelis that the situation is unbearable and has to be resolved. In some ways it's an irony that when the security situation is terrible, there's a sense that we can't have any movement, and when the situation is quiet, then it's like when your roof is leaking, you can't fix it, and when it's not raining, why bother fixing it?
Well, standing at the back, Jonathan.
Thanks. Mark Braverman. I want to ask a question that you may punt and say it's way outside of your area, and also it sort of talks about the longed-for, perhaps fantastic future. But I want to talk about negotiations toward a two-state solution. I think we're all aware of the fact that there apparently are negotiations and a process actively being pursued right now to make that come about basically between our government and the other Palestinian Authority and Israel. And I think my concern, the concern of many others, is that that the blueprint or the map is already in place. People are talking about borders, but that if any kind of two-state solution, if in fact such a thing can happen, is going to happen and be successful, that it's going to have less to do with borders than with human rights, land issues, access, what it's like on the ground, particularly for Palestinians. And I wonder if B'Tselem if you have your eye on that at all, if there's any way that you are involved or looking at or in communication with folks who are talking about those things, specifically with respect to human rights and what such a solution might look like.
Thank you.
So at this point, we're not involved in the political. If you're talking about the proximity talks or if there are other talks going on, we're not involved in those. We're not playing a role. It would be the case, like we did during the Oslo process, once you have specific proposals that are made public, if it's clear that those proposals are not going to ensure human rights, either of Israelis or Palestinians, we would speak out. I mean, again, as we did both for the Gaza disengagement and during the Oslo process when we were looking at things like the resolution of the water arrangements or the East Jerusalem arrangements or other sorts of issues where it's clear that you have to bring human rights into that. It can't be, again, all about bargaining chips that one can be exchanged or sacrificed for the other, that there are certain things that can't be compromised. But at this point, that's not taking place.
I'm going to take one more at the back, Jonathan Bykart. So you use your judgment.
Thank you. I'm Ed Mickey with American Arabic News Agency.
Hello.
Hi. And my question is, from your work over the past few years, do you see the conditions of human rights inside Israel getting worse? Is there an influence what's happening around the world? Today on my way here, I just heard on the news that a NATO missile killed some 50-plus Afghani civilians. And the U.S. has the Abu Ghraib scandal, and then you have Gitmo, and the Arab region is getting even worse. What's the impact of all that on the Israeli public? Do they say everybody's abusing everybody, why not us? So is there an impact of what's happening around on the Israeli public and the government there? Thank you.
So I think it's quite different if you look at the public rhetoric as opposed to the actual policies on the ground. In terms of policies on the ground, I don't see a negative influence to, well, I don't know. It's quite an interesting question. I mean, to think about post-9/11 America and, say, interrogation techniques, renditions, arbitrary detentions, to what extent that influenced Israel or the opposite, I mean, in terms of policies on the ground. But certainly in terms of the rhetoric, you hear quite a bit as a way to deflect criticism from Israel. Look at all the other terrible places around the world.
I'm going to go right to the front here and take the two front rows, and we'll
Hello.
draw it to a close.
Hello.
Relatively soon.
Abdurrahman Babajan from Turkey, Istanbul. I am studying my PhD studies in Istanbul, Department of Political Science, and now working as an intern in SETA Foundation, DC. In your honest speech, you used the term in talking about the flotilla. It's so attracting for me. So you used a disaster or a nightmare for maybe also Israel. Maybe my question is directly relating with the term you mean. Upon the flotilla craze, Israel government has been forced to reassess the strategy of Israel Gaza siege. What are the potential possible outcomes if we witness some new flotilla, mainly sourcing maybe from Free Gaza movement, from European countries? What are your assessments?
I mean, I don't know in terms of the actual initiatives. Again, I think, as Daniel said, nature abhors a vacuum. If there isn't leadership that's going to cause a change, if the situation in Gaza is a pressure cooker that's going to explode, then it's to be expected that other initiatives will step in to fill that vacuum. Certainly, it's not in Israel's interest that it be forced to re-examine the policy under those circumstances. I mean, my hope is that from the perspective of human rights and international humanitarian law, not because of the pressure of certain activist groups or political initiatives, that Israel would be brought to understand that the current siege on Gaza is neither legal or moral, nor in its own best interest.
And just behind you.
Thank you very much. I'm Benjamin Tua from the Council for the National Interest. My question concerns the issue of incitement, and we hear in the United States a considerable amount about incitement by the Palestinians in the textbooks and things like that. And we also hear to some extent about settler vigilante activities and that sort of stuff, but we don't hear too much about incitement, Israeli Jewish incitement in Israel itself, such as chants kill the Arabs at sports events and other things. Could you say something about the trend that these things are taking and the effect to which actions by members of the Knesset have on this type of activity?
I'm not the expert on these topics, but I think you have touched on the different issues of concern. I mean, my personal view is that there is too much tolerance for this sort of, like you say, that my daughter's school, that somebody had written on the wall, "Death to Arabs," and it was there for weeks, written on the wall with no one taking it down. And that's not uncommon. And as you say, at football matches, soccer matches, that people will yell "Death to Arabs." So something that would be not tolerated. I mean, the Israel is not a devotee of First Amendment the way the United States is, and yet there is this tolerance of hatred of Arabs that is too prevalent, I think, in the public discourse.
Thank you. My name is Liz Salat, and I'm on my own. My question is, could you say a little bit about the amount and the impact of money from the American Jewish community coming into the settlement area and the West Bank?
Well, I'll put it in the context, one of these initiatives in the Knesset to restrict the activity of human rights organizations is to look at European government funding, which is one of the primary sources of support for B'Tselem and other human rights organizations. And the initiative is to somehow claim that we are not, that we are in some way compromised because we're receiving government funds. But in fact, it is the case that almost every initiative in Israel, I mean, both political and social initiatives, as well as hospitals, universities, are dependent on funds from abroad, whether it's European Union, which is the major source of funding for a whole host of initiatives, or, like you say, Jewish community donations, which are going, I mean, not only to settlements, but they're coming to B'Tselem. I mean, it's a whole spectrum. And I'm not the expert in terms of quantifying how much money is going from the Jewish community into these initiatives. I mean, certainly it is a question when you're talking in some cases about illegal activity of settlements. I mean, you have money coming from the United States to support the unauthorized outposts in the settlements, in some cases the most sort of militant, violent communities inside Israel that are receiving funds from the United States.
Now, clarify for us, because one of the issues that's come up here is, and there was a very large New York Times report on this recently, of tax-exempt 501c3s moving money into the settlements. But part of that was the lack of reportage on the U.S. side. Now, I'm not asking you to comment on the U.S. side. In other words, some of these organizations simply weren't living up to the standards of transparency.
Right.
What's the situation on the Israeli side? What's the transparency rules?
It's the same. I mean, it's quite ironic. Again, the initiative in the Knesset to attack our funding sources is under the headline of transparency.
Right.
Although, of course, human rights organizations are the most transparent. I mean, you go to our website, you see all our funding. You go to the registrar of NGO, nonprofit organizations, you see all of our financial information. as I understand it, the least transparent organizations are some of these settlement organizations. I mean, you try to find out who is funding El-Ad or Ateret Kohanim, the organizations in East Jerusalem that are encouraging settlers taking over Palestinian houses. In East Jerusalem, it's very hard to figure out who is funding them, I mean, to follow the money trail.
So that page on your website isn't mirrored on those websites?
Right.
Okay. We'll take one from this forest of hands in the middle there, and I think that will have to be our...
Steve Riskin. I don't represent anyone. I'm based
Hello.
at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Hi, Jessica. It's good to see you again.
Me too.
It's more of a comment of a couple of previous questions about balance, and I was troubled by and I think you went some way to answer the question about balance. Why don't you have why don't you attack the Palestinians for their human rights record? And I think it's important to remember that international human rights, and Israel is a signatory to, I think, most of the conventions, if not all, that they're not comparative. You don't, I'm better than the people next door. These are absolute, and your mandate is very limited.
Right.
It is to hold the Israeli government accountable for, and there are many Palestinian human rights organizations whose mandate it is to hold the government in Gaza and the government in West Bank. Right. So if there's any balance here, it would be, and I'm troubled by the Israel-Palestine balance in this regard when it relates to human rights. But if it's answering the issue of Israeli human rights record, it would be to have a government official, and I'm sure you've had, Daniel, many government officials on your platform here talking about this. But that's where the balance is, because you relate to the Israeli government, and you seem to have a pretty reasonable relationship with it, wanting to hold it accountable,
right,
but informing them of your work and trying to work in some ways, to some limited ways, because human rights organizations their purpose is to hold their governments accountable.
Right.
So I think it was just to express kind of concern about the framework of balance here, and that I didn't think it's probably not appropriate to, it's certainly beyond your mandate, but the balance is with the Israeli government if you want to have an answer to what you have to say.
Right.
Anyway.
Thanks for that.
I appreciate that contribution, Steve. I'm afraid I'm going to stay here for our last question.
Hi, I'm Sarah Harlan from Palestine Note. I wanted to know if you could comment on B'Tselem's position on Avigdor Lieberman's sort of secondary Gaza disengagement plan, sealing the Gaza border, and also what the implications could be for Palestinian Israelis in the two-state solution. Thanks.
So, I mean, the current Israeli control over Gaza is to sort of have your cake and eat it too, right? That we control Gaza, but say we don't have any responsibility for Gaza. I mean, obviously that's an untenable position. If you're controlling everything that gets in and out, the airspace, the territorial waters, the population registry, you have legal obligations. It's not clear to me in terms of Avigdor Lieberman's proposal. I mean, obviously he wants less responsibility. The question is whether he is giving up control. I mean, theoretically, if Israel allows or no longer controls the airspace and the territorial waters around Gaza, if they're allowed to build an airport and a seaport, certainly Israel's legal obligations would be greatly reduced. It's not at all clear that that's what he's talking about.
Is there we're going to wrap up. Is there anything else you haven't covered that you want to throw out there? No is a fine answer.
No, I think we've covered quite a bit.
I think we've covered a great deal. So I just wanted to give you that opportunity.
Thanks.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us. But I really want to thank Jessica.